Hey everybody, can you guys hear the birds chirping in the background? I have my window open for some fresh air, because it's finally like warm enough to have my window open, so I'm just enjoying it being open.
I actually can a little bit, but it's kind of soothing.
I feel like it's like, atmospheric.
Yes. Okay.
Um anyway, like welcome back to the podcast, y'all. Did anything interesting or true crimey happen to you guys this week? I just recently got back from a trip to Las Vegas
And she
and
didn't die.
but at the same time,
You didn't get true
I've,
crimed.
I've never been catcalled that much in my life.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, don't catcall women. But so yeah, this week's episode is on the English House of Horrors. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this.
Yeah, I'm excited.
It so I just realized we don't do a lot of British cases. Like we did that one in Australia. Have we done any in England yet?
We did
That are
a
set?
French one.
Yeah, I don't think
Oh,
we've
French
done
one.
anything.
Yeah, we haven't done one in England. Jack the Ripper, not Jack the Ripper, the Yorkshire Ripper. Jack the Ripper, it's like from the 1800s.
Yeah. Is the
Do
Yorkshire Ripper coming up?
he's on my list of people. So I kind of went on like a kick where I ended up watching a bunch of episodes of like some true crime documentaries on Netflix. So I watched a
Uh-huh.
little bit of Son of Sam, and then I watched a little bit of
Was the Son of Sam one good?
yeah, it starts off kind of slow, but that's on my list to like actually finish the research because I watched the episodes, but like it's really hard to take notes and watch TV at the same time. So I'm gonna go
Yeah.
back and read over like the case stuff that I can find on the internet and do that episode. So his name's David Berkowitz. That's on my list. And then the Yorkshire Ripper is on my list too. So we'll do another English case eventually. And maybe I'll start looking at like true crime, British true crime cases and see if I can find anything because I think I mean, there is true crime in every country. So we could do some
Yeah.
cases, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, and what's nice is like they have I mean, there's like reporting is very similar to ours, and so like same with Canada.
Right.
So like
Yeah.
you usually can find a decent amount of stuff on the internet, like archived news stories and stuff. So yeah, anyway, this this is like a really terrible like married killer duo. I mean, not only were they killers, they were just like all around terrible human beings, but
You said
um
married like that was going to make it better. You're like, they're a
well,
married duo.
I meaning like it's like one of these situations where like two psycho people meet each other um even though the universe like that
Yeah,
should never
sure.
happen, but like anywho, this is one of those situations where two crazy people just happen to meet each other and I guess fall in love in their own weird like sadistic way. And it turned out very badly for a lot of people, including the people that got married. So, uh, we're going to start off by introducing the patriarch of the family that ended up being the story in the House of Horrors. His name was Fred West. And good old Fred was born September 29th, 1941, to a family of poor farm workers it's called Much Marcel. It's in Herefordshire, which I believe is southern England. Don't quote me on that. Basically, Fred's father was like a fan of corporal punishment. Is corporal where it's physical? Corporal? Yeah, because corp, body.
Sure.
Sure. Uh, anyway, he was a fan of hitting his children. And his mother, on the other hand, like weirdly contrasting to that, was like super overbearing and like overprotective and kind of coddled her children, especially the boys. But Fred was her favorite. He was her favorite of her six children. And Fred seemed to not really be like friends with a lot of his peers. Is it because he had a weird overprotective mother? Perhaps. But, apparently a lot of like his peers from grade school, when they were asked, they were like, yeah, he like was like really good with his hands and he was really good at like physical tasks, but he like was not literate. Like he was really bad at reading and writing. So, um, for this reason, most likely, he left school at age 15. So this was around December 1956 that he left school, and he started working as a farmhand. So, which is what his family did. Like they were just, poor laborers. Fred, at like later in life, he claimed that he was introduced to sex by his mother around age 12. And as well as around this time, he started engaging in bestiality.
Oh.
He also claimed that, so Fred also claimed that he saw his father like raping his sisters and kind of saw this as like a normal, like incest. He saw incest as being like somewhat normal because he remembers seeing a lot of his dad doing that kind of thing around this time. And, so that it's almost like he like uses his later actions, like he uses this to like justify his later actions. Like he's like, oh, well, I was raised in like this weird household and I'm not responsible at all for my actions because my dad made it seem like it was so normal to, like incest was so normal. Apparently Fred's brother Doug, though, was like, yeah, this is bullshit. Whether or not that's true or whether or not Doug just like didn't know about it or maybe it genuinely wasn't happening, that remains to be seen probably. But according to Fred, his dad kind of normalized incest for him from a very young age. Was the bestiality his father's doing? Probably not. Fred was probably just a weirdo. Let's be clear on that. In 1957, Fred and his brother John began socializing at like a youth club, so like kind of just like a youth center. By this time, Fred was like 16. Anyway, the youth club was in Ledbury, and a lot of the other people at the club kind of saw them as like trailer trash and like country trash because they had a really thick, it's called a Herefordshire accent. I'm not like super familiar with like the different English accents really, like, but apparently like certain ones you can kind of tell where somebody is from in England by like their accent. I don't know if you know more about that, Hannah.
I don't, but yes, there is like somebody. So like for example, Connor's great aunt and great uncle, they're like from different areas of England and they sound different, right? Like they've been married for a long time, but they don't sound the same. Yes, I mean same with like in the United States where different places have different accents. So
Yeah. But like for whatever reason they were like considered even more, like they had an even stronger country accent, even though they were in an area where probably everybody had like somewhat of a country accent. But I would assume it's also sort of like where you get your education, because I mean that's sort of how it is in the US. Like colloquialisms are different depending on like
right, or like
what
if
kind of
you
school, like did you go to a private school or did you go
yeah,
to,
or
like
were you raised on a farm? Like did you not have the greatest education when you were a kid? Like were you kind of like stereotypically were you like raised in a way that you would be brought up to have a little bit of a different like not even like necessarily accent but like dialect, like the words you choose to use would be different
uh-huh.
if you depending on where you were raised, but very similar to the United States. So
Yeah, definitely. So basically, Fred and John, like, they weren't like super popular because of that, because people are judgy, but also because I guess Fred like aggressively pursued women, like, and pretty much anytime a girl, like a young woman, got close to him, he kind of like grabbed their ass or grabbed their boobs. Like, he was kind of known to be like just super forward. And I mean, maybe it obviously it worked sometimes because he was kind of known to like the women that he have like talked into sleeping with him were like, yeah, he was terrible because he only really cared about himself getting off. And like
yeah,
he wasn't like a pleaser or
well
anything.
it
Like,
sounds like he lacked like just basic self-control. Like
oh, totally, yeah.
if he wanted something he would try to get it, is what it
Yeah.
sounds like.
And yeah, again, like the women that he actually did convince to have sex with him were like, yeah, he was like super selfish and like didn't really give a shit that we like he didn't care like who was there as long as somebody was there, you know? Like as disgusting as that sounds, like he very much saw women as objects and he very much had like a very like sexist view of like sex. Like he kind of like saw women as being like the pleasure givers and it's like it didn't really matter anything past that, right? Like women were sex objects to Fred from a very young age. Where he learned that, you know, you could probably like argue that there was different places that he learned it from. Was it from his father? Maybe. Just cuz that's how most young men like learn their attachments, not attachment style. They're like their perception of women they learn from however their dad or their father figure because that's I mean this was like a long time ago so it was like a much more patriarchal society than it is now so especially in like a small town like I'm sure it was very like old fashioned but you know he was old fashioned to the extreme, right? He was like, yeah, these women are here for my pleasure and that's it. They're sex objects, like 100%. Even at 16, you know, when he started going to this club. Um, for Fred's 17th birthday, he bought a motorcycle, and he crashed it 2 months later. So, is karma real? Probably. I would argue yes. And this might have been karma for young Fred who liked to fondle women and couldn't take no for an answer. Um, in this crash, he suffered a fractured skull, a broken arm, and a broken leg, and he had to use like a brace for a long time because he couldn't walk well while it was healing. He was also unconscious in the hospital for a week, and this kind of led to like a lifelong fear of hospitals because he was in a hospital bed for a week, and he also obviously he sustained a pretty severe head injury and for like the immediate time following the accident he had like really intense outbursts of rage, like uncontrollable rage, which likely had to do with his prefrontal lobe being damaged. This is kind of important because your prefrontal lobe is your ability to think critically. It's your ability to see consequences for your actions before you do them. Like, and most people's prefrontal lobes aren't fully developed until, especially men, like 25 is what they
Yeah.
say. So
Well,
it's very likely his brain had some serious injury to it that
right.
changed his life for the worse, honestly.
So clearly, like he obviously had some issues, but we would have never known, like if he would have turned out to do what he had like actually did if he hadn't been in that accident, because you would have to imagine that would play at least some part in it. Like yeah, he was pretty messed up beforehand, but like you said, it takes out like even more of like his sense of like what is right and what is wrong. So
Yeah. Well, and yeah, the thing about head trauma is like, I mean, that's your entire who you are as a person is in your brain. So like head trauma can cause some serious like life altering changes to your personality. Like, even if you were a semi decent person before the head trauma, like which obviously Fred was not, it can change your entire personality. So 2 years later, a woman that Fred had tried to grope on a fire escape at the youth club punched him apparently and like kind of fought back, and he fell down 2 flights of stairs and like hit his head again in like the same spot. So again, one, serious head trauma is pretty intense. Two, like within a couple years while your brain is still like forming its fully functioning capabilities, like that's insane, like that's a lot.
like case in point, there something clearly was wrong with his brain after this point that like made him do what he actually went on to do.
Well, and
Like,
like
it just
one,
kept escalating too.
Yeah.
yeah, one head injury is, okay, not okay, but like, and then two within a couple years, like while your brain is still forming,
Still
like,
healing too.
yeah. June of 1961, Fred was about to be 20, so he was just over 19, and his 13-year-old sister Kitty told her mother that Fred had been raping her for 6 months and he had gotten her pregnant. Kitty refused to testify against him in a court case, and pretty much the case collapsed because of that, because she wouldn't testify against him. Fred apparently like was freely saying like, yeah, I'd been molesting girls since his early teens. I don't know that I couldn't find that he like specifically admitted to raping his sister, but he'd been groping and inappropriately touching young girls pretty much his entire pubescent life, and even slightly before that. Um, it seems like Fred, like whatever relationship he had with his family was completely fractured after this. Like it doesn't seem like he really talked to anybody in his family except for his brother John after this. And it does seem like John for a little bit like wasn't speaking to him, and he kind of started again. But it seems like the family was pretty convinced that he was doing it, but like they couldn't necessarily get him in trouble with the law because Kitty, obviously she was traumatized and she was impregnated. So like I couldn't exactly find what came of that. I'm sure there's somewhere you can find it, but it was so long ago that also I'm sure the child is protected. So
Good.
that's if she kept it. So a little bit about Fred's first marriage. So Catherine Costello, she went by Reina. She was a woman from Glasgow who became impregnated by an Asian bus driver. She was unmarried, and at this time it was not only was it weird to have children with somebody of a different race, but it was, even more looked down upon to have children out of wedlock. Fred and Reina, they met previously when Reina was living in England. But basically, like, Reina had moved to England because her parents were like, oh my gosh, you can't raise your mixed race child in our household. Like, so she kind of ran away from Glasgow, Scotland, by the way. And she met Fred. Basically, like, she knew Fred from before, and then she went back home to Glasgow, got pregnant. Her parents kicked her out, so she went to live with Fred. And they, fell in love and they got married. Fred was 21 at the time when they got married in November of 1962. Reina's daughter, Charmaine, was born March 1963, and the couple claimed that Reina had miscarried, and Reina was walking around pregnant when she got married to Fred, and to, like, explain why the baby was half Asian, they were like, oh, she miscarried, and we actually adopted this child.
They thought that was gonna convince people.
Like it's not that far off. Like it would be a really weird coincidence, like if the timing worked out that way. But I mean, like, I guess technically it's possible, right?
Yeah.
Well, so like, I mean, I'm assuming that I don't think people would have believed it was his child anyway. You know what I mean? Because they had just gotten married. And so Charmaine, Reina, and Fred all moved to Bridgeton, Glasgow. So that's like just a district of Glasgow. In July 1964, Anna Marie was born. This is Reina and Fred's first child. So they, got pretty busy like right away. Even though Reina had literally just had a child with another man. Reina like loved the children, and she, was a devoted mother, and it really seemed like she like wanted to be a mother, and she like enjoyed raising children. But Fred was like he was kind of a dick to them, honestly, and like he made like this like jail cell, quote unquote, out of their bunk bed, where he kind of just like put some bars across the bottom part of the bunk bed so that like, and he would keep them in there when he like wasn't home. Or he kept them in there when he was home, and he only let them out when he wasn't home. Like, he, like, straight up just, like, hated children. Like, he didn't want to see them when he was home.
Damn.
So in that sense, that does make me think that they're probably, like, that would be from a direct correlation of, like, his dad treating them like shit, like him and his brothers and sisters or whatever.
Yeah.
That seems like pretty, like, on trend for me. Like, it makes sense that he would hate children if his dad hated him. So
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, I think honestly having two children under the age of two probably like I mean, obviously he wasn't a good dude, but I think it was like he like didn't want kids like running around the house basically. Like when he was home, he basically didn't want to see them. Like they were only really allowed to like walk around their own home when he wasn't there. Um so Fred, being the awesome man that he was, he had like numerous affairs. So he was married to Reina, but he was fucking everybody basically. There's like uh there's alleged that he fathered at least one child during this period with one of his affairs. Um Obviously we don't necessarily know who that is, but um he was having enough sex with enough random women that he had to have like by odds fathered at least one child.
Right.
Um so because so Reina, poor Reina, she knew Fred was fucking around on her, and she, was like, "Oh, you're messing around on me. I'm going to start a relationship with somebody too, and I'm going to have an affair." So she started seeing John McLaughlin. Basically when Fred found out about this, because Fred, only men are allowed to cheat on their wives. Wives are not allowed to cheat on their husbands. He like brutally beat her several times, because anytime he even thought that she was out with John, he like beat her when she got home. Once McLaughlin realized that Fred was like beating up Raina, and like it was sort of because of him, he like would regularly come to the house and start fights with Fred and like beat the shit out of him. Fred was like an
Bill
actual
McLaughlin.
no, like Fred was like a little pussy. Like he liked to hit women because, he was bigger than them, and like they didn't really want to, like they couldn't
Yeah,
fight
he
back.
didn't want to fight men.
But yeah, as soon as it came to like men, like no. He like literally he didn't stand a chance against John. John beat the shit out of him several times. McLaughlin apparently, he like said this later in an interview, he witnessed one time Fred like slap Charmaine across the face because she asked if she could have ice cream. So Fred at this time was an ice cream truck driver. And Charmaine was like, "Can I have an ice cream?" And he like slapped her across the face for
What a
asking,
gem.
basically. Um and so on November 4th, 1965, there was an incident where Fred basically accidentally ran over and killed a small boy with his ice cream truck.
Oh!
Um,
I was hoping you
he
were gonna say animal.
No, it was a child.
Oh my
And
gosh.
he, for obvious, and like I'm pretty sure it was an accident. Like it's not like he intentionally ran
I
this
don't
kid
really
over.
think it matters.
Um, but for obvious reasons, he freaked out, and so he ran away. They fled to I think it's Gloucester. I I know all those like weird like Worcestershire, like I know they're all kind of like you say them in a different way, but I think it's
Yeah.
Gloucester, Gloucester.
Gloucester, but there are so many places in like England that literally the names, I'm just like, I'm sorry, what? Like, or they're like,
You're skipping entire syllables.
or they're like multiple words. So it's like something on something, or
What?
something. Like it's like multiple words instead of just like one name for a city. Like that's very
Yeah.
common. So I understand the confusion. I'm confused right now as we speak.
Yeah, basically Fred was like, "Oh my God, they're gonna come arrest me for manslaughter." So he rented like a caravan, like a trailer, like a camper trailer in Gloucester. And they started living there. So Raina, um, and the children, along with they had a nanny named, I think it's Isa McNeil, and then they had like this family friend. Her name was Anna Mcfaul. She kind of comes into play later. She was like a teenager at the time, and she kind of like was like friends with Raina, but she also was mostly friends with Isa. And they basically, Raina, the kids, Isa, and Anne all joined Fred in Gloucester in February of 1966. So they, they all start living in this like tiny little trailer. I want to say I read somewhere it was 2 bedrooms. Don't quote me on that. And like, bedrooms being the key word, right? It's a trailer. It's like a single wide trailer. Um, And, with everybody living together in the same house, tensions were high because Fred is a dick. Like, sorry, was a dick. Fred was a dick. He, like, straight up, like, it was, like, his way or the highway. So, around this time, he also began working at a slaughterhouse, which, for somebody who has homicidal tendencies, working at a slaughterhouse is probably not the best way to make them not homicidal. But obviously, like, this didn't necessarily, working at the slaughterhouse didn't quell his desire to kill people, because he regularly beat the shit out of Reina and Issa, because he was still having these, like, super, like, random outbursts of rage, and so he would just beat them like absolutely crazy. There were several times when he beat Charmaine. It seemed like he didn't have as much of an issue beating Charmaine as he did Anne. Anne was a little bit, she was like a year younger, but I think because, as terrible as it is, Charmaine wasn't his kid, so he had like a little bit more of a distant perspective on it, like when he was beating her. Fred also encouraged Reina to prostitute herself, because he was the only one working, and I guess they needed more money to help support the household.
Prostitution is obviously the only option for a career.
Again, Fred, it's very obvious very obvious what he thought of women, and it wasn't a very nice thought at all. So Reina and Issa, they eventually joined forces with Mclaughlin to escape from Fred. Mclaughlin and Issa's boyfriend, John Trotter, both of their names are John and John. Basically, they they arrive at the caravan in the middle of the night, and they had kind of like devised this plan ahead of time where they were going to escape and run away. But Anne, remember teenager Anne, she knew about this plan, and I guess by this time she kind of like had become infatuated with Fred. Like, she had like a weird crush on him. And she had told him the entire plan. She had told him that they were planning on running away. And so like Fred and Anne were like waiting there when the Johns got there.
Anne, no.
Yeah.
Anne, no. Why?
Yeah, she was not very sisterly. She wasn't their sister, but like, she was like in love with Fred for whatever reason, even though Fred had nothing to offer. So Fred and John McLaughlin, they had a physical fight. The police were called. Basically, by the end of it, Reina and Issa, they ran off. The Johns ran off, and Fred said that if he ever saw them again, he'd kill them. So Reina and Issa and the Johns, they escaped. The children are still with Fred. Reina was like, she's kind of scared to try to take the children because it had ended so violently last time. But she had, like, she didn't really have a choice. She was like very scared that Fred would kill her. And like, I mean, that's not unreasonable. It kind of sounded like he was the kind of guy to just like beat her too much one day and her die. She visited a lot of times though to make sure the kids were okay. She also was like really fucking mad that Anne was like pretending to be their mother, because she was Fred's little like tattletale. And yeah, Reina was pretty pissed. She was pissed at Fred. She was pissed at Anne.
What's wrong with Anne? Like, aside from
probably
the fact that she's like in love with him.
I wonder if it
anything
was
else?
some like weird like grooming situation. Like, I wonder if that's like
Because
kind of how
just
it went.
as a note, look up Fred West real quick, just while you're listening to this. Not like this man was like good looking or anything.
No, he had almost nothing to offer. He wasn't smart. He wasn't smart.
Right, and she knows that he's abusing everybody, so like there's no way that she thought he had any redeeming qualities. It must have been some sort of like a manipulation, grooming sort of situation.
Well, and like Fred had power, and maybe like she was weird because she was young. She was a teenager. But so on one occasion, Reina was really, she's really pissed off at Fred. She's really pissed off at Anne. She's like, I can't believe you're keeping one of the children who's not even biologically Fred's captive, basically. And she was so pissed off that she like stole some stuff out of the trailer, and then like fled to Glasgow. I think it was some of Anne's stuff. For whatever reason, it seemed like she was mostly mad at Anne for like spilling the beans on their escape. But basically, Reina got caught for like stealing stuff because, you know, justice is never served in this world. So she got in trouble for stealing shit, and she got like 3 years probation for it. Anne eventually moved out of Fred's caravan. It seemed like for a second, like she was kind of gonna go do her own thing, but she also was kind of at the same time like hoping that Fred would divorce Reina and marry her because she again was weirdly in love with him. Also, Anne was from Scotland, and she kind of, I think, saw like she didn't necessarily see herself moving back to Scotland, and the only way she could stay in England is if Fred married her. Obviously this is her logic, right? Like this isn't my logic. I'm like telling
really
you
could have
what
found
was
like
probably going through her brain.
She literally could have
Literally
found,
any
like,
man.
literally anybody else, like
Literally anybody
any
else.
other man on the street. Like I don't even care, like just literally anybody else. But oh well.
Literally anybody else. But yeah, I'm kind of relaying. This is like what Anne wrote in the letters that she wrote to her family between 1966 and 1967. She was like, I don't really want to go back to Scotland because her good friend Isa McNeil, who was the nanny for Fred's family, she had gone back to Scotland. Her and Reina are in Glasgow, and Isa, I think, was writing her being like, you should join us, like you're not safe there. And I mean, in the end they were right, but you know, poor young Anne probably was misled, I feel like, and it sucks, but she kind of paid for it, you know. So Anne Mcfaul became pregnant with Fred's child at age 18, and in July 1987, she disappeared. At this point, she was about 8 months pregnant. Her dismembered remains were found buried in a cornfield near Much Marcel. This is where Fred was born.
Caitlin
and
never gives us any transition. She's just like, her remains were found. And I'm like, when the fuck did she die?
She's dead.
The thing is we don't really know what happened to her. We know she was 8 months pregnant when when she was seen last. And we know that her body was found in a field in June 1994.
And was
So,
the baby
you know,
alive?
that's like 7 years. So,
Was the baby still in her?
yeah. So,
Okay.
well, so it appeared that like the baby was not in her when they found the remains. Like there wasn't remains of a child.
But they don't think she gave birth?
We don't know. We have
Like,
no
the
idea.
baby could
I
be
was not.
alive.
Like, is there a
not-
baby that they like had that Fred had in his possession that could have been her child by chance, or is the baby like, dead too?
The baby has to be dead. Like there's no way. Like, you know, it wasn't that long ago. Like there would have been evidence of this child, you know.
Yeah, I guess maybe. I don't know. I definitely think it's a possibility.
Like I literally now I'm like curious because now I didn't like dig super deep because it seemed pretty obvious that like this baby just died, like because he stabbed her. He later admitted to stabbing her, but he did later admit that they like had a fight and he stabbed her. I think by that point because like this baby, like Anne Mcfaul was never reported missing. She just kind of like stopped existing. Like I think like Fred had probably completely isolated her, so I doubt she had like a lot of friends other than like, you know, her family, but they were so far away that yeah, anyway. They know that Fred was involved though because basically whoever killed Anne, which it was Fred, that he had like disarticulated all of her limbs like super carefully, so meaning he like popped them out of the sockets. He kept most of her finger bones, like most of them weren't in the grave site that they found. He kept them as souvenirs, by the way. And yeah, it didn't seem like there was the remains of a baby in the grave. So whatever happened to the baby, I sort of don't want to know, like, because I hope it, I mean, I'm sure it was something bad.
like, there
So
was probably something really bad that happened. He doesn't even like his own kids, let alone like a baby. I mean, that was his own kid, but let alone an unborn child. Like, I doubt that he would have had any remorse at all for
I
killing like a
agree.
kid. So
so the remains of Anne Mcfaul, there was like remnants of like fabric stuck to all of her bones, like her skeleton. And they believe that this probably means she was tied up at some point. Yes, this like 8-month pregnant woman was tied up. Basically, I don't know. Fred kind of went back and forth on this story, but more or less it just sounds like he like stabbed her and he was upset. He probably instantly killed her. The baby died later. It's for the most part, it doesn't sound like he dismembers them it's like he partially dismembers them to make them easier to bury, but he also partially dismembers them because he wants to keep bones as like trinkets, essentially.
No.
Yeah.
No, Fred, no.
So after Anne died, Reina briefly returned to live with Fred. At this point, he lived in the Lake House Caravan Park, but she left like within the year. And basically anytime Fred didn't have a woman living with him, so like between the time when Anne died and Reina came back and like then Reina left, basically anytime there wasn't a woman there, like social services like had the children because Fred like did not give two shits about raising children. Like that was like not his priority. He believed in every aspect that like that was a woman's job. So anytime there wasn't a woman around, he was not taking care of his children at all. So in comes Rosemary. Rosemary Letts was born November 29th, 1953 to a poor family, just like Fred. She was the fifth of 7 children. And Rose's mother, her name was Daisy, which weirdly enough is also Fred's mom's name. Yeah, like I didn't really realize that until later, and I was like, oh, they're both their moms are named Daisy. That's kind of strange.
Mm.
What's up, Hannah?
Well, at first I thought you meant, never mind. I was gonna say like maybe that has something to do with the fact that he was a little bit too into his mother, if you know what I mean.
If you're picking up what I'm putting down.
Which is like literally plain English. Like he was into his mother. His mother taught him something about sex, and then he became the way he is. So anyway.
Well, and remember, Fred was born in 1941, so Rosemary is about 12 years younger than him. So Rose's mother, Daisy, she suffered depression like her entire life, and while she was pregnant with Rose, and as well as several of her other children, she was getting electroconvulsive therapy, which at the time was a very common treatment for depression. Was it healthy for a pregnant woman? Absolutely not. As if you needed to be explained that. So after Rose's parents separated, she lived with her mother for like 6 months and then moved in with her father at age 16. They lived in Bishop's Cleeve, Gloucestershire.
Once again.
Gloucester.
Connor, do you know how to say what would be the British pronunciation of Gloucestershire?
Oh God, Hannah, that was bad.
Connor says he doesn't know. Sorry, guys.
Oh, our expert witness. Anyway, yeah, she went to live with him at like age 16. Rose's father was a paranoid schizophrenic. Rosemary did not have healthy parents at all, right? Like while Fred's parents seemed like mostly mentally stable, Rose's parents had serious mental health issues. Her father was a paranoid schizophrenic. He repeatedly sexually abused Rose, as well as her older sister Patricia. Rose would allegedly like because she had such a weird perception of sex and sexuality, because like I just can't even imagine how messed up your perception of sex would be if like your own parent was having sex with you. Like, not to get super graphic, I forgot to put a trigger warning at the beginning of this, but lots of incest is going to be present in this story. If that is triggering to you, stop listening now. Hopefully you've already stopped listening if you are triggered by incest, but I mean, not to say that everyone isn't triggered by incest, but and just sexual abuse by a parent. And again, I can't really imagine how much that would skew your perception of like your sexuality and being hypersexualized constantly. Not to say that parents who sexually abuse their children are motivated by sex. It's much more about power, but you know, as a young woman, like just barely hitting puberty, like I could see how you would feel so like you would start to notice like what aggravated your parents and what caused them to sexually assault you. And I'm sure that would give you such a weird perception of like your body and like being sexualized. And this is pretty evident because Rose like allegedly would parade around her home naked all the time, or like semi-naked, like just in her underwear. And she did it like specifically in front of her younger brother Graham, who was like 3 years younger than her. At age 13, Rose began molesting Graham and as well as her youngest brother Gordon. Rose sexually assaulted Graham at least once when he was 12. Meaning like there is like a little bit of a distinction there because she was molesting him pre-puberty, and then it attacked him at least once as far as like sexual intercourse. So basically Rose was like a super fucked up person, and it's important to note that she was fucked up on her own. She was fucked up before she met Fred. And these were two just very fucked up people that happened to cross paths in early 1969. Summer of 69. I know. What a terrible summer for them to have met.
The song
But,
was not written about them. BT Dubs.
No, because
69. Sorry, I had to.
they met when Fred was 27 and Rose had just turned 15. When they first sat, yeah, exactly. I guess this is, so we'll play some like romantic piano music. They sat next to each other.
Oh, it's more like horror movie, but okay.
Actually, horror music probably makes more sense.
Yes.
So they met when they sat next to each other at Cheltenham bus station. Rose apparently like the first time she saw him was like absolutely grossed out because Fred like didn't really care what he looked like, right? Like he didn't take good care of himself. He probably was like super unshaven, and he had probably like really scraggly hair, really scraggly mustache and beard, and she basically was like, this is disgusting. But Fred, the romantic that he is, kept showing up and sitting next to her and complimenting her and telling her how he, as a 27-year-old man, thought she was so beautiful. Remember, she was 15. And, you know,
Absolutely
somehow,
not.
I'm trying to think of, like, the scraggliest, grossest man I can think of showing up and sitting next to me at a bus stop and constantly telling me I was pretty. I don't know that I would take that bus anymore.
Like, and would you fall in love with him and like move, like be in
Exactly.
a relationship with him? That's even more
Exactly.
far-fetched. Like maybe you need to take that bus, but like love him? No, you don't need to do
But
that.
also, like, you know, as gross as it sounds, like, maybe she was weirdly, because she was molested by her father and sexually assaulted by her father, like, she probably was, like, weirdly, like, it made sense to her to be interested in an older man because her father was older. Like, you know, in some, like, weird, perverted way. Like, I wonder if that's what she saw in him, was, like, a fatherly figure. But, like, anyway. Fred quickly saw how promiscuous Rose was, and he he kind of like was pretty quick to want to start a relationship with her because, again, Fred didn't like taking care of his children and he wanted somebody to watch his children, right? And I guess he's told Rose this like really sob story one time and was like, my children's mother abandoned them and I need somebody to take care of them, and I would love to have more children because the mother of my current children has abandoned us, and like I want to have more kids, and like you're a young buck and like let's have kids together, you know? I don't know why my Fred voice sounds like that.
It sounds
Basically,
like too similar to your voice. You need to make it more different, otherwise.
oh,
it's just
okay,
weird.
sorry. I'm not good at voices. I'm not
just
good at like
kidding.
accents either. I can't even do a British accent, honestly. Now that I just tried to do it and I can't even think of how to do it. So Fred Fred, again, the romantic. He found out where Rose worked. She worked at this like bakery, and he showed up to ask her out on a date. Apparently, like the story goes that he asked a woman to go into the shop and like give a gift to Rose and say, "Oh, it's from that guy outside," like some random guy outside. I think like basically the woman was like no, and so Fred went in and asked her out anyway. But that's like how the
Iconic.
story
Like,
goes.
that would literally be me. That was just like, no, I'm not gonna do that. Bye.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
So Rose began dating Fred and caring for his daughters, because Fred only sees women as caretakers and sex objects. But yeah, anyway, Rose kind of felt bad for the kids, I think, because again, their father was Fred and their mother wasn't around because she was afraid of their father. And initially in the beginning, like, it seems like Rose kind of like took them under her wing. She took them on like little adventures to collect flowers. She took them on like walks around like the little town. And she very much had like kind of like a older sister attachment to them. Fred at one point convinced Rose to leave her job, to care for the children full time. And Rose was like, well, like my parents are going to notice that I'm not sending money home, from like the job I told them I had. And he was like, well, what if I give you some money so you can like pretend that you still have a job, right? And Rose was like, sure, why not? Sure, I guess. We're already in some weird relationship, so why not? Several months later, Rose for some reason thought it was a good idea to introduce Fred to her family and her parents. Fred, who is 12 years older than her. Her parents, you know, for all the bad things that they have done, they were like, what the fuck? This is a grown man. Like, you're a child.
Right.
And her father, I guess, like, threatened to call social services several times if Fred, like, didn't ditch his daughter, basically. Yeah, basically, Rose's dad was like, fuck no. I think he actually did call he eventually called the authorities. And she was put in like a home for troubled teens in Cheltenham in August of 1969. So like shortly after they started dating. She was allowed to like leave every once in a while because she was in like a home for like kids that like teenagers that the parents didn't know what to do with them because they were crazy. And she was allowed to like take visits to leave her to visit her family. And she rarely visited her family. She usually went and visited Fred, because, you know, for whatever it is, Fred really like got to her. Yeah. On Rose's 16th birthday, she got to leave like the home she was staying in. And she returned back to her parents' home. She wasn't there for very long. I think it was like not even a couple months. And before she immediately moved back in with Fred. At this point, he was living in a flat in Cheltenham, so like not super far from the like troubled teens home she was living in. Fred went and picked up his kids from social services because, again, anytime there was not a woman in the house, he just was like, here, just take my children. I don't want to deal with them because I don't have a woman to deal
Wait,
with
are
them.
we sure that social services was like okay with that? Like,
So
I'm
I
confused.
I'm assuming it was like a lack of resources issue. Rose's father, knowing Rose moved back in with Fred, had Rose examined by a police surgeon in February of 1970, who determined that she was pregnant and that Fred had been having, well, I mean, technically it was consensual because she was 16, which is the age of consent. But, I mean, they basically were like, this is fucked up. You need to get rid of this kid. This is like a very inappropriate relationship. They let her go from the hospital on March 6, 1970, after she promised that she would abort the child. She didn't, and she had the kid, and basically after this, Rose's parents like didn't really talk to her anymore. I think they had like kind of been like, well, we did all we could do, you know? And not that not that Rose's dad really could say much. Like, he literally raped her and probably fucked her up enough that she ended up with Fred, is all I'm gonna say. Like, anyway, her parents kind of gave up on her. They stopped talking to her around this point. And Rose and Fred, they moved into a 2-story house. They lived on like the bottom floor of like this house. And it was on Midland Road in Gloucester on October 17th, 1970. Rose's first child and Fred's third, fourth, something, was born. Her name was Heather Ann. There is a lot of speculation, and this is intense, so prepare yourselves. Make sure you're sitting down, or don't swerve into the road if you're driving. Swerve off the road, not into the road. There was a lot of speculation that the child that Rose gave birth to was actually fathered by her father and not Fred. He had been like raping her pretty regularly.
But is that possible? Like
timeline wise, it is very possible. Especially because she was back living with them briefly, after she got out of the home for troubled teens. So, and again, there wouldn't necessarily be the speculation if it wasn't possible. Rose's dad was not a good dude. Anyway, 2 months after Heather was born, Fred was imprisoned for theft. He did a lot of like petty crimes. Like, he would literally just like steal random shit and try to resell it. I read somewhere that like he was like stealing like tires and car parts to resell. I think that's why he was imprisoned on this specific occasion. And he was imprisoned until June 24th of 1971. At this time, Rose was 17, and she was now responsible for 3 children. She was responsible for Charmaine, Anne Marie, and Heather. Anna Marie. Anna Marie later said that Rose repeatedly emotionally and physically abused her and Charmaine. And I want to emphasize that, like, Rose was literally a child taking care of other children. So
other children that weren't hers, and even
some
the
of
one
that,
that,
yeah.
one of the ones that was hers, regardless of if it was Fred's or her father's, was a product of like possibly non-consensual sex, right?
Yeah.
So like it's not that far-fetched that she was treating, I mean, obviously it's horrible, but like she was in a crappy situation, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't really have much sympathy for her because I know what happens. But yeah, I get what you're saying.
But yeah, anyway, Anna Marie like later was like, so Anna Marie wrote like a book or something like that, or no, was it Anna Marie? Somebody wrote a book, and a lot of the kids that were still alive when the book was written, like gave like stories of like what their childhood was like, getting raised by Rose and Fred. And basically Anna Marie said that Rose was like having a tough time raising 3 children, honestly, but she also was like really mad that Charmaine specifically like didn't really like react when she was abused or like put down or disciplined. Like, Charmaine was very like strong-willed, and she kind of it seems like Charmaine was like really stuck in this whole like my mom is gonna come back and she's gonna take me away from all of this shit. Her mom being Reina.
Yeah.
Because again, she wasn't living with anybody who was remotely biologically related to her, and she knew that, right? So she I guess she used to say her real mummy, in quotes, would eventually come back to her. And Rose, like, was really pissed by this, apparently. Like, probably for no reason. Rose kind of just sounded like she was kind of just, like, an angry person all the time anyway. Hell, she, like, her mom literally got electroconvulsive therapy while she was in the womb, so... Did she have great impulse control or a fully developed prefrontal cortex? Or probably not. Probably not is the answer to all those questions. A childhood friend of Charmaine and Anna Marie said that she once witnessed Charmaine like standing on top of a chair, naked and gagged, with her hands tied behind her back in the kitchen. And like basically like the friend had like walked in the front door to like play with Charmaine and Anna Marie, and she saw Charmaine like being physically and verbally abused by Rose as like a punishment, right? And there was one occasion where Charmaine received medical care at the hospital for a puncture wound in her left ankle. This was March 28th, 1971. And, you know, this is kind of the turning point. There is one victim that is believed to, like, have occurred before this. There was, like, a 15-year-old named Mary Bastholm who was killed around this time, 1968. There's not a lot of like details on it, but West, one of his sons that he goes on to have, believes that this was his father that did this. So just keep that in mind. But the first one that we're like sure of is about to happen, the first murder. Yeah, we're gonna pause right here for part 2. We hope you join us back for the next episode. Let us know what you think so far about this case. If you know anything about this case, we'd love to hear from you guys. I know there wasn't like a ton of action, as terrible as that sounds, in this episode. But there's some crazy shit about to happen in part 2. So prepare yourself, to get some palate cleansers in there between if you're binging these episodes.
Watch like
Do something in the middle. Do something in the middle here before you move on to part 2, because you will need it, because shit gets pretty intense.
Because like basically up to this point, there's been a lot of bad stuff that's happened, but like the stuff that's gonna happen in the next episode that we're gonna talk about is like way worse. So
if you think it's bad now, do some self-care this week, guys.
Right, and if you're binging this, like, take a break before you listen to part 2. I would highly recommend. Thanks so much for listening, guys. As I said, hopefully you'll join us for the next episode. We'd love to see you guys in part 2 of this Fred and Rosemary West saga of horror bullshit. And until then, you can find us on Instagram at Who What Where Podcast. We're also on Facebook, as well as everywhere you get your podcasts. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you next week in part 2.